With a story like this, you have to be careful to try and get the balance between attaching human feelings to an animal and, on the other hand, treating Tyke as if she had no emotions whatsoever. So I'll try and stick to the facts, and you can make your own mind up as to whether Tyke the elephant was victim or perpetrator. What I will say is that elephants certainly do exhibit signs of not only intelligence but also emotional traits. What is known is that elephants form deep, lifelong bonds within their herds, particularly between mothers and calves, and that their emotional lives reflect a complexity which is comparatively rare in the animal kingdom. They've been observed mourning their dead, standing vigil over the bodies, touching the bones with their trunks, and even returning to that same spot years later on. When separated from companions, elephants can show signs of stress, depression, and social withdrawal. In captivity, they've been known to cry, refuse food, and sway rhythmically, behaviours interpreted by some experts as signs of psychological distress. Whatever the precise boundaries of these feelings, elephants clearly experience loss, attachment, and emotional pain in ways that certainly echo humans. So, how did Tyke, an African elephant, end up in Hawaii in the first place? Well, it's believed that Tyke was probably rounded up as a calf back in Mozambique sometime in the 1970s, most likely orphaned during a cull. This probably happened during the chaotic time when Mozambique gained independence from Portugal in the mid-70s. Park rangers and game wardens were short of cash but had plenty of guns and ammo, and they pursued a somewhat hands-on, aggressive approach in their wildlife management. In theory, these wildlife culls were meant to control overpopulation in protected areas like national parks and game reserves, where elephants were said to be exceeding the carrying capacity of the land, i.e. they were damaging vegetation and threatening other species, or they were coming into close proximity with human settlements. But in practice, these culls were basically just for money. In the mid-1970s, a live elephant calf captured during a cull in Mozambique could fetch anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 depending on its health and its age. Government employees, sometimes working with private contractors, would kill adult elephants, typically entire family groups, and then separate and capture the calves, who were easier to then manage and sell on. The ivory tusks were sawn off the dead adults to be sold. The elephant calves were loaded onto trucks, sedated, and prepared for sale to foreign buyers. Needless to say, this was not a gentle process. Calves were often captured within minutes of witnessing their mothers or entire family units killed. So stress, trauma, and injury were common, and many calves did not survive the initial capture or transport phase. So it's very likely that if Tyke did have any memories of Africa, it would have been memories like those, and she wouldn't have been alone. By 1985, just 10 years after the end of Portuguese rule, Mozambique's elephant population had been reduced to a fraction of its former size. Anyway, having survived the cull and been sold to a broker, she was transported, most likely on a cargo ship, to the United States, where she was leased through John Cunio's Hawthorne Corporation. This was a company that supplied elephants to travelling circuses across the United States. Over the years, she'd performed under different names with different trainers before she ended up with Circus International, a small touring outfit run by Cuneo himself. Her trainer at Circus International was a man named Alan Campbell, a veteran handler who by this time had spent decades in the business and was well known for his skill of keeping the elephants in line. Tyke would have spent most of her life in transit. She was put in one trailer and shunted from one town to the next, unloaded into makeshift enclosures, and kept chained for long hours between shows. And this was standard practice in the circus circuit of the time. When she wasn't performing, she was probably restrained with leg chains, often on hard surfaces, with little space to move around in. Training relied on tools like bull hooks. These were metal-tipped poles that were used to guide and correct behaviour through pressure and pain. Her trainer Alan Campbell likely did what he believed was necessary to keep Tyke under control, but the routine of daily life as a circus elephant was built around domination and control. It wasn't about animal welfare. So food, space and social contact were all limited. Even if Campbell treated her well by circus standards, those standards would have still involved isolation, confinement and discipline, which was enforced through fear basically. And for a wild animal built to roam in close-knit herds across wide open landscapes, the psychological strain for Tyke would have been constant. It's probably for us it'd be something like a headache that just, never goes away. By the summer of 1994, Circus International had set up at the Neil Blaisdell Centre in Honolulu, a modest venue normally used for concerts and basketball games. It had been converted into a temporary big top for the circus. Now, Honolulu wasn't a regular stop for mainland circuses, so the event drew a curious crowd of families, tourists and the local press. Tyke had been performing in the city for several days without any incident, although handlers had noticed that she seemed on edge and was reluctant to enter the ring. Now, this might have been down to the fact that in order to get to Hawaii, she'd probably been shipped by sea again. This might have evoked memories of that earlier trip from Africa. And even if it didn't evoke any of those memories, the trip was probably stressful anyway. You can find below decks, the ship's rolling and pitching, and the journey's 2,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean. Now, due to the graphic nature of this footage, I've had to edit some of it to avoid YouTube restrictions, but the full video is over on my Patreon page and it's free to view. The link is down in the description. On the morning of Saturday, August the 20th, 1994, Tyke's final performance took place. As the packed arena awaited Tyke's entrance, the crowd heard a loud trumpeting from behind the curtains and Tyke suddenly burst through into view. The crowd was stunned. Tyke appeared to be holding a life-size dummy, which she was throwing around wildly. The crowd didn't really know what to make of this, but most thought it was part of the act. What they hadn't realised was that it was no dummy. It was in fact her groomer, Dallas Beckwith, who had approached her to adjust the headdress. Tyke had grabbed him with her trunk, trumpeted loudly and swung her head before charging through the curtains, where she proceeded to knock him to the ground and kick him around like a football. As Beckwith scrambled in vain to move away, she stomped down on him, crushing his leg and dragging him across the floor. The trainer, Alan Campbell, dressed in the glitzy suit, quickly rushed out in front of Tyke, shouting for her to back down, but she was in no mood to be pacified. She caught him head-on, threw him down to the ground, and seemingly head-butted him while he was on the floor, grinding his head down into the floor. Several witnesses later said that they heard his bones breaking as he was slammed into the ground. There was a brief stillness and then a flurry of movement as the panicked crowd realised that this was all going wrong and made for the exits. Tyke repeatedly stomped and kicked at Campbell and Beckwith, kicking them around like rag dolls before she began to pace across the ring. Campbell's inert body lay to one side as Beckwith was dragged away by colleagues. Tyke then trumpets angrily, eyeing the crowd. She seemed to see the people running for the exits, and she too makes a dash for freedom, knocking over some spectators on her way out. And in under a minute, the 3.5-ton African elephant was out of the Blaisdell Centre and roaming free on the streets of Honolulu. Circus promoter Steve Hirano ran after her, dialing 911 on his mobile phone. Outside, she turned onto Ward Avenue, a main artery through the Kakauku district. Cars driving in the streets had to swerve to avoid her, others abandoned their vehicles mid-road, fleeing in panic. Some people took cover in nearby shops while others just stood watching. Within minutes, police officers were on the scene, and they initially tried to contain her using patrol cars to kind of form a loose perimeter, but Tyke wasn't going to be contained so easily. She moved erratically, sometimes pausing to trumpet, and sometimes actually charging towards cars and people. Now, the police were armed with standard service pistols and rifles, but ideally they wanted to tranquilise Tyke, as they were under orders not to shoot her unless there was an imminent threat to human life. Unsurprisingly, they had no elephant gun on hand or tranquilizers suitable for the 3.5-ton elephant. And for nearly half an hour or more, Tyke ran wild through several blocks. At every turn, the damage was increased. Parked cars were crushed, fences were trampled, and a fire hydrant was torn from its base. As news of the rampaging elephant had spread, the crowds of curious onlookers had grown. People watched from the safety of first-floor balconies, while reporters filmed from a distance and a helicopter circled overhead. Tyler Ralston was driving down Waimanu Street when he saw Tyke approaching. The elephant was coming at me and the police were behind it. I saw this headdress on the elephant and I thought, there's a circus in town and this elephant has got away. Ralston saw the circus promoter Steve Hirano's ill-fated attempt to corral Tyke in a fenced-off area. Tyke was chasing a circus clown through a vacant lot while the circus promoter, Steve Hirano, attempted to confine the animal within the lot. Hirano was trying to close the fence and the elephant charged at him, busted through, soccer-balled him on the ground and then hit him, shattering his leg. And that's when the first shots were fired. The next thing I knew, it was running by me, all bloody. Now, reports as to what happened next are somewhat confusing. Wikipedia states that the shots fired at Tyke when she attacked Hirano were only warning shots which caused her to flee. Police officers then followed in pursuit before firing an oddly accurate description of 86 to 87 shots before Tyke collapsed and died. News reports from the time say that things played out differently. The 6 or 7 shots that were fired at Tyke when she attacked Hirano actually hit the elephant, causing her to flee, and with the cops in pursuit. Tyke, critically wounded, began to stagger before collapsing at the side of a blue Camaro. At this point, veterinary surgeons approached Tyke with tranquilizers to try and sedate her, but seeing the extent of her injuries, they decided against this. They asked a police marksman to shoot Tyke in the heart, which he did, but this didn't kill her. At this point, the vets decided to give Tyke an overdose of tranquilizers, which was enough to finally put her down. Whatever the actual version of events, it ends the same way, Tyke lying dead next to the Camaro parked on the street. The shock was palpable. Some onlookers started crying, others simply stared in disbelief. One man described it as watching the end of something that we just didn't understand. There were human casualties too. Alan Campbell was dead at the scene, and groomer Dallas Beckwith had been severely injured. Reports listed up to 13 others hurt, although these were minor. Some of the police officers involved in this also required counselling after the incident. The investigation into Tyke's Honolulu rampage showed that Tyke did have a documented history of aggression. There had been previous escapes, as mentioned, handler injuries, and repeated signs of stress, although none of this had prevented Tyke from being used in the shows. An autopsy on Alan Campbell's body added a further factor, as it was shown that he had both cocaine and alcohol in his system, although it remains unclear as to whether this influenced anything to do with his handling on the day. Circus International denied any knowledge of substance abuse by Campbell, and the Hawthorne Corporation, which owned Tyke, refused to comment beyond a brief statement of condolence. In the weeks that followed, the footage from Tyke's escape into the streets of Honolulu circulated worldwide. The chase through the urban streets, and the death of the elephant under gunfire. Public reaction was split. Some saw Tyke as a dangerous animal that had to be stopped before anyone else got killed. Others saw Tyke as a victim of captivity, an elephant that had been pushed beyond the limits of her endurance. Animal rights groups seized on the moment to campaign for bans on circus animals point blank. The Hawthorne Corporation, who owned Tyke, came under increased scrutiny from the US Department of Agriculture, and over the next decade, it lost its license for the multiple Animal Welfare Act violations, and eventually it had to surrender its remaining elephants, who all went to live at an elephant sanctuary in Tennessee. As for Tyke, her body was removed later that evening using cranes and flatbed trucks. The street was hosed down before dawn, and by morning only a few scorch marks and scattered debris remained to show where the rampage had taken place. And the following day, the arena reopened for basketball practice. The posters advertising Circus International were taken down, replaced by the usual community notices and upcoming attractions. Needless to say, none of those upcoming attractions included a circus.